So room size and shape and what to do about it. So long story short, the bigger and more irregular the shape of your room, the better. But of course, not everybody has access to a space that is like 30 by 20 feet. So what do you do if you are in a smaller room? As a general rule of thumb, the bigger the room, the lower the percentage of acoustic coverage needed. So for example, in a room that is 23 feet by 16 feet, which is the size of my home studio, I have enough absorbers, mostly bass traps, to cover around 30% of the room's surfaces. In a room that is 8 foot by 9 foot, I would probably cover around 60% in acoustic absorbers, most of which would be bass traps. Now, having a higher percentage of absorbers in a small room will make the sound more dead, but it's kind of worth the trade-off as you'll be taming frequencies that can be very detrimental to your mixing. As always, it's about balance and working within your limitations. Also, one vital thing is if you're in a really small room, use smaller monitors. I'll leave it at that for now, as we will be looking at that in more detail later. So acoustic absorbers, bass traps and panels. So this is one of the main staples of the home studio, what most of you will need more than anything else. Now, a quick distinction, a bass trap is not really a bass trap. It doesn't actually trap anything. It's an absorber, and all it does is lessen the energy of the frequencies passing through it. Really, the main distinction between an absorber and a bass trap is its positioning in the room. A bass trap will ideally sit away from the wall to maximize bass energy reduction, and in almost all studios, the bass traps go in the corners or the edges of the room at a 45-degree angle, as this is where you can get a build-up of sub and bass frequencies. And also, who has the room to put bass traps sitting a foot away from the wall all around the room? So of course you can buy acoustic absorbers that are made from foam and other materials, and of course you can make them yourself, which we'll show you how to do later on. As a general rule, you are better off using broadband absorbers, which means they will have an effect on a larger frequency range rather than just affecting the low frequencies or just the high frequencies. Remember, you want as even a frequency response as possible. The problem with any absorber is this: bass frequencies require much deeper material to have any decent reduction effect, whereas high frequencies can be absorbed by a much thinner material. This is one of the reasons why just placing a lot of thin acoustic foam around your studio is actually a bad idea. You will probably end up just affecting the high frequencies, and the low and mid bass frequencies will remain completely unaffected by them. And what happens if you take all of the high frequency reflections away but still have the low, mid and bass frequencies? You end up with an unbalanced environment, and therefore not a predictable space to work in. This is why the main thing that we will add to our studio is going to be bass traps. As bass traps are going to be made from a broadband absorbing material, they will affect all frequencies, so it will tame any high-end reflections as well. So diffusers are used not to absorb reverberations but to spread them out. So if you have a blank wall at the back of your studio, for example, and you're getting unwanted direct reflections from it, and you don't want to deaden the sound of your studio anymore, then you could use a diffuser to spread the reflection out and avoid any direct reflections that are coming from that surface. These can be used on walls and objects alike that are in your mixing environment to stop any nasty reflections. Very generally speaking, and more for home studio producers, you want to focus on absorbers first and foremost. Diffusers are used when you already have enough acoustic absorption in your space, meaning a good balance of direct sound and indirect sound has been reached, and you don't want the space to sound any deader, but you're still getting sort of too much acoustic reverberation from a given surface in your environment. Again, this is more of a general rule, but in a studio that is under 20 by 15 feet, I would probably not even bother with diffusers unless it's against the back wall. The problem with diffusers is they are more expensive, they are suited to larger spaces, and you really want them no closer than 5 to 6 feet from your listening or recording position, as they do at close range add a localized distortion to the reflected sound. For the back wall of your studio, you could use a bookshelf with plenty of books on. Now, I know using a bookshelf for this has been a hot topic from time to time, as it's not a true diffuser, and that is correct. It is sort of part diffuser, part absorber, but it is still better than getting nasty reflections off your back wall. If you do this, just try and randomize the position and depth of the books so they do diffuse the sound as much as possible. And just like with absorbers, they will have an effective frequency range as well. So the shallower the diffuser, the less effective it will be at diffusing low frequencies. So if it is the bass that's being reflected from your back wall that is the problem, then you will need to have a pretty deep diffuser to actually have any effect on the sub bass. So monitors and monitor positioning. So distance from the wall. You really want your speakers 2 or 3 feet away from the wall where at all possible. If you have a bay window, then you can get away with putting your monitors closer to the windows, as the glass will only affect the very highest frequencies and will not really interfere with the resonance of the box, so in the monitor casing. In this case, we don't have that option, so we're going to try and minimize any damaging reflections by adding a rock wool panel to this wall behind me. So this is one of the limitations of this space that we're just going to have to accept. Monitors should ideally be on separate and heavy stands. If sat on the desk, then some sort of acoustic foam should be used between the desk and the monitors, as the vibrations from the speaker will actually transfer to the desk and you will actually be hearing some of the desk sound as it resonates. You want the speakers to be the same distance from the walls on either side. This is important to get a decent and accurate stereo image. Again, in this room, we're actually limited by the shape of it, and that it is also used as a living room as well. So the panel we're going to put up on that back wall should help us out a little bit in that respect. So size of monitors versus room size. As I touched on earlier, simply you do not want to put a big pair of speakers in a small room. If you have a big room, you would be better off having speakers big enough to sort of fill the space. And of course, the bigger the speaker with the bigger drivers, would be able to reproduce lower frequencies. And with that, smaller speakers do not reproduce the low end, particularly the sub bass, as well as bigger speakers with the bigger drivers. So in a small room, like our earlier example of 8 foot by 9 foot, then this will actually help, as one of the biggest problems with smaller rooms is the amount of low energy reflection that you're going to get. So size your monitors based on the size of your room. If you are in a smaller size room or need to have your speakers close to a wall like we do in this situation, then you really want to get monitors that have front mounted bass ports. If you have rear facing bass ports and they are up against a wall or close to the wall, you'll be interfering with the pressure that the speaker can output, and therefore the response of the driver will not work as intended. The angle of your monitors, especially for near and midfield monitors, should be pointing directly at your mixing position, not facing directly forwards. So mixing position. You really want your mix position to be in the middle and equal distance away from your monitors, basically forming an equilateral triangle, and ideally you want your mixing position to be an even distance from the walls on either side of you as well. This means that right and left reflections will reach you at the same time. If you have right side reflections reaching you before the left side reflections, or vice versa, then you'll get an imbalance in the perceived stereo field, and this leads nicely onto early reflections. So taming early reflections. An early reflection is a reflection that reaches your ear so quickly after the direct sound has reached your ear that your brain can't tell the difference between the two. In other words, you just hear it as one sound. So early reflections usually come from the walls on either side of your mixing position, the floor, the ceiling, and sometimes the desk or mixing console that you have in front of you. You can't and don't want to get rid of all early reflections, though it is super important to try and tame these as much as possible, as they will mess with your perception of the stereo field, amongst other things. To do this, we put absorption panels on either side of our mixing position and also above our mixing position, which is called the cloud. So what we end up in a traditional rectangular room will be this: a room with bass traps in each corner and almost all the way around between the join of the wall and the ceiling. Then we'll add our panels around the mix position to combat any earlier reflections, mainly our side panels and then our cloud. If you could add a bookshelf or a proper acoustic diffuser to the back wall, then this would be about as close to perfect as you can get. In this room, we can't do a lot of what we would really like to do, but again, you just got to work with your limitations of your space.